Good evening and welcome to a Vegas PBS election special. I'm Elizabeth Thompson.
And I'm Steve Sebelius. Tonight's debate is being held before a studio audience. For the next 30 minutes, we'll be posing questions to advocates on opposing sides of ballot question 3, the education initiative. This question asks voters to enact a 2% margins tax on Nevada business.
Opening and closing statements, in addition to the first question, have been determined by a coin toss. And now I'd like to introduce the spokespeople participating in tonight's debate. Karen Griffin is here on behalf of the coalition to defeat the margins tax. And Dan Hart is here on behalf of the Nevada State Education Association to debate in favor of question 3.
Dan Hart, you have the first opening statement.
Thank you, Steve. And I'd like to thank Channel 10 for providing this opportunity to debate this very important issue. And it is a very important issue. It's one of the most important, if not the most important, that we will see on the ballot in this election. Not only will it fund education, but it also supplies a self-determination to our community. It allows us to determine what the future of our community will be for ourselves and for our kids. Now, my opponent will tell you that it's a deeply flawed initiative. And the over and under of that during this debate is probably somewhere around 18. But the fact is, her corporate clients find anything that's find anything that they have to pay deeply flawed. So keep an eye on that. This has been very personal for me, this campaign. I have 2 children in the public schools, and through them, I have seen the overcrowded classrooms. I have seen the teachers trying to perform miracles without adequate resources. The only way we fix this is by passing question 3 this election. Thank you.
Thank you. And now your opening statement, Karen Griffin.
Thank you so much. Question 3, as Dan mentioned, is a deeply flawed tax measure that will do nothing to guarantee additional funds for our state's education system. What we know it will do is hurt jobs, damage our economy, cripple our economic development efforts, and it will increase costs for Nevada consumers. Things like food, clothing, utilities, rents, child care, even health care costs would be increased if the margin tax passes in November. Those are just a few reasons why it deserves a no vote. You will hear Dan talk a lot about corporate profits, but unfortunately, the margin tax is not based on the ability to pay. So even if a business is operating at a loss, it would still be required to pay its margin tax liability. Beyond that, there is, again, no guarantee that it'll increase education funding. In fact, Dan has admitted that himself, as well as the NSEA's attorney admitted it before the state Supreme Court. So this would create a new 2% tax on the gross revenues of businesses with revenues of anything over $1 million a year, which ends up creating a fiscal cliff for many businesses. A business that has just $1 over $1 million in revenue would be subject to this tax not just on the dollar, but on their entire revenue. So we call that a fiscal cliff, and it's also unfair. Those are some of the reasons question 3 deserves a no vote.
All right, and now we'll move on to the question portion of the debate. And the first question is for you, Mr. Hart. One feature of the education initiative is that it would require even businesses that lose money in a given year to pay, provided that business earns even $1 more than the $1 million threshold that Ms. Griffin just mentioned. Isn't that just fundamentally unfair?
No, in fact, it's not. And in fact, our gaming tax is exactly that way too, and the modified business tax. There's no calculation of profits here. You pay the tax if you hit a certain income level. In addition to that, Karen and I participated in a PBS discussion up in Reno. The head of the economics department from UNR was there. He said that the idea of doing this without considering profits makes it a much better policy decision, that it broadens the base, it makes it less volatile. So I think that it's just a canard. It's something that people throw out there as, it's just people who do not want to pay the tax, so they're providing excuses.
Ms. Griffin, your response.
You know, the margin tax sounds like a small amount of money. 2% doesn't sound like a lot, but because it's based on revenue, it's actually the equivalent of, on average, a 14 to 15% corporate income tax rate. We call California a high tax state here in the state of Nevada, but California's corporate income tax rate is just 8.8%. So on average, this tax would be nearly double California's corporate income tax rate. It would make Nevada one of the top 5 states in the nation as far as taxes on businesses. So we would have the top 4 or 5 highest business tax rates in the nation. It simply does not make sense, and it deserves a no vote.
Mr. Hart?
That is absolutely untrue. It is just absolutely untrue.
It is true.
I thought
we won't be addressing one another directly during the debate. Those rules were agreed to prior by both parties. Mr. Hart,
it's absolutely untrue. In fact, if you want to compare our state to any other state, we don't have an income tax. And most, over 70% of businesses are subchapter S corporations or LLCs, where they pass through the profits to individuals and they're taxed there. We don't have that in our state. So we're still going to be a low tax state. It's just another one of these things that the opponents throw out to confuse the issue, to make it more complicated, and to convince people not to vote for this.
Ms. Griffin, the next question is to you. Why is it that, for example, the owner of a KFC franchise in Phoenix, Arizona, or Salt Lake City, Utah, can afford to pay a corporate income tax in those states, but your group is contending that the KFC franchise owner here in Nevada makes more than $1 million, shouldn't pay? Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's not makes more than $1 million, Steve. It's more than $1 million in revenue, which is all the sales that come through the door. So even though that business may have more than $1 million in revenue, they may have very, very small profit margins. And as I just mentioned, this is the equivalent of, on average, a 14 to 15% corporate income tax rate. That is significantly higher than any taxes that you'll see anywhere on the West Coast, including California, Utah, and Arizona, like you just mentioned. So we're really talking about something that is significantly higher. And remember that many small businesses that have over $1 million in revenue also operate on tiny profit margins. You know, grocery stores, for instance, they're a really good example. Most grocery stores operate on just 1 or 2% profit margins. So many of those stores would either, their profits would be wiped out and they may have to raise prices or shut their doors as a result of this tax. And a KFC could very well be another example of something very similar to that. This tax is
That's time for that answer. Mr. Hart, why should the KFC franchise owner pay another state?
More scare tactics from the opponents. This is what they do. This is what they're about. One thing we have to realize here is that 87% of the businesses in Nevada would not be subject to this tax. Only the largest 13% of businesses would be subject to the tax. And anybody who is making $1 million, and then we have deductions for the cost of goods sold or for salaries and benefits, and so the liability is reduced. This is a tax that is aimed at big businesses and only big businesses.
Ms. Griffin, your rebuttal?
Well, if the NSEA was looking to tax businesses, big businesses, as Dan says, then $1 million in revenue was a really low bar for that. You know, $1 million in revenue is a small business with a couple of employees in a whole lot of cases. You know, you heard Dan mention that only 13% of the businesses here in the state of Nevada would be impacted by this tax. But 80% of Nevada's businesses are single-person entities. Someone like Karen Griffin hanging my own shingle, or a business that incorporated here for our tax benefits. And not only that, but he's not including affiliated
We're out of time for that rebuttal, but we'll be back to you in a sec. Mr. Hart, next question is to you. Now in Texas, there is a similar margins tax, but it has exemptions for businesses such as healthcare, for the insurance industry, and for some other things. Shouldn't Nevada's version have had those same exemptions?
I don't believe so. We have an entirely different tax structure than they do. They've been tinkering with this law for a long time. So it remains to be seen how effective their version is versus ours. I think the less exempt, once you start opening up a law to exemptions, then all the wealthy corporate lobbyists will come in and sculpt it to their liking. I think that the flatter the fee and the wider the base, the better off we are.
Ms. Griffin, the Texas law has exemptions. Should ours have had those exemptions?
You know, certainly they should have at least examined some of those. Unfortunately, the Nevada margin tax doesn't even exempt Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement payments. Those payments are, for the most part, already well below the cost of providing that care. And now those doctors and now those hospitals and now those clinics will be taxed 2% on the revenue that is already below the cost of providing care. Beyond that, this tax is significantly different than the Texas tax because it is 2 times higher for most businesses, and it is 4 times higher for retailers, wholesalers, and restaurants. It's a significantly different tax, and really in many cases it's like comparing apples and oranges, because the proponents basically took a lot of the guts, if you will, of the tax and then removed all the things that protect industry, protect things like health care, protect the insurance companies, protect
and that's time for that. Mr. Hart,
what about protecting our kids? We've gone through several questions here, and we haven't even talked about the schools and what's needed in the schools. And I think that's the important part of this. If you don't believe that we need money for education, then question 3 is probably not for you. But if you think we need to stop the overcrowding in our classrooms and provide more money for teachers and the resources to teach our kids and provide our kids the opportunity to succeed, then you should vote for question 3.
All right, on to our next question. Ms. Griffin, since business groups such as the Chamber of Commerce have opposed every tax plan that has been brought before the legislature for roughly the last 15 years, isn't it reasonable for voters to conclude that members of your coalition, including the Chamber, would oppose any tax on business regardless of the structure?
You know, first of all, I don't speak specifically for the Chamber of Commerce, but I can tell you that if they were standing up here, they would not agree that they have said no to every single tax in the last 15 years. You know, and beyond that, because we have groups like the AFL-CIO and the Culinary who are opposed to question 3, those are folks that regularly stand side by side with the NSEA. But they realize that this tax is so poorly written, it hurts our economy. It would cause the loss of jobs. We would see higher costs for food, clothing, utilities, rents, and it damages our economy and economic development, which, by the way, is how the trades grow. When we have growth in our state, that's how our trades and the AFL-CIO folks, that's how their industry grows. And they can't stand to lose another job. They are still at 40 to 50% unemployment in the trades. A no vote on question 3 is not a no vote to education.
Mr. Hart?
Of course it is. And you're absolutely right that the business community has never got behind a tax for education. The politicians and the business community for decades have told us, oh yes, we need to fund education, we need to fund education, but maybe not now, and maybe not this proposal, and maybe we do this, but you know what? It hasn't happened. And this is what happens when those people fail to step up to the plate. We have question 3. And now it's up to the residents, the voters, and the Nevadans to decide what the future of our state looks like. And it's about time we took this into our own hands, because we've been let down consistently.
Ms. Griffin?
You know, Dan talks a lot about education, but unfortunately the margin tax initiative does not guarantee that a single penny will go in to further fund education. We know this money will go into the state's distributive school account, but there is no guarantee that the money that is already in that account won't be funneled out. And Dan has admitted it himself. Their attorney has admitted it himself. There is no guarantee we'll see additional funds for education. So you can talk about what he's talking about all day long, but there's no plan and no guarantee for question 3.
On that point, I'd like to address a question to Mr. Hart specifically, and you brought this up yourself a few minutes ago. So legally, the Education Initiative cannot make a requirement for how money raised by this tax will be spent, nor can the voters themselves bind future legislatures to any particular level or type of spending. As a result, there is really no way to guarantee that all the money raised by this tax and all the money currently allocated to schools will be spent on education. Is there? And if that's the case, shouldn't the voters be wary that this money could go for other needs?
No, the money, I mean, it's Section 1 of the bill says the money I'm tired of this argument about the money from the bill goes to education, goes to the distributive school account. It provides a stable and well-funded source of money for K through 12 education. Now, the issue of whether the legislature level funds in the future, I think, is a critical one, but it can't be discussed in the course of an initiative. I'm sure Karen and her corporate chieftains would have challenged us and thrown us off the ballot if we had tried to include that. We would love to have had that in there. There was an initiative in 2000 that was thrown out for that reason. But what I would like to ask, if Karen is so concerned about this, why don't you join us and ask the legislature to level fund education and to use...
Mr. Hart, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because we did agree, and I interrupted Ms. Griffin earlier, that we would not be addressing questions directly to the other party, but I will direct a similar question to Ms. Griffin. So same question I asked Mr. Hart on this issue of whether the legislature might, if the question passes and all this new money shows up for education, the legislature might then decide to take some of the currently allocated funds out of that fund and move it somewhere else. So is that valid, or can you make an argument perhaps on behalf of your opponent that you believe the legislature will direct all that money to education?
I cannot support Dan's claims, but what I can say is this: you are correct. And as recently as we have a long history here in the state of Nevada of diverting funds that were supposed to go to things like education, and as recently as 2009, with the room tax increases in Clark and Washoe counties, those were supposed to be directed to education. They have never once gone to increase education funding here in the state of Nevada. That's just the most recent example. And, you know, we've seen it time and time again throughout the decades here in Nevada. Those are just some of the reasons that it deserves a no vote. And, you know, Dan himself will talk a lot about, well, you know, the initiative says, and yes, the initiative does say that the money will go in the state's distributive school account. But again, there is no guarantee that the money that's already in that account will not be swept out and used for other portions of the budget, desperately needed things like, say, mental health funding here in the state of Nevada.
Mr. Hart, you'll have an opportunity to respond to that rebuttal.
Listen, it's a political reality that the education funding will go up if question 3 passes. It absolutely will, and I would bet every dollar I have that it will. And we'll see, Karen, we will see. But the fact of the matter is, you and your organization have done nothing to help education funding. You talk about the room tax. Well, did you petition the legislature to make sure that stayed in education? I don't think you did.
Your time is up, and also we'll be directing the questions for the remainder. Go ahead, Steve.
All right, final question to Ms. Griffin. Here in Nevada, casinos pay on their gross gaming win. The mining industry pays a net proceeds of minerals tax that may actually increase if question 2 passes, but the businesses pay nothing on their revenue. Is that a fair situation?
You know, I can't speak to whether the current business taxes are fair or unfair. I specifically speak about question 3, which is deeply flawed and it is very costly. And because it is the average of a 14 to 15% corporate income tax rate here in the state of Nevada, it deserves a no vote. Beyond that, we know that some industries would end up paying significantly higher rates. For example, for the trucking industry, this is the equivalent of about a 75% 10% corporate income tax rate on that industry. And that's because they cannot deduct their most expensive costs of doing business, their trucks, their tires, and their fuel. And you will see that throughout other industries and other business models as well. Those are just some of the reasons this deserves a no vote. This is something I can speak about, interestingly, all day long. I can talk about all the reasons why this tax is bad and we don't need it here in Nevada.
Mr. Hart?
I'd like to hear her idea of a good tax. Probably one, a sales tax on the working men and women of Nevada. The fact of the matter is, Steve, you make a very good point, that there is no revenue source from business revenue. There's no tax revenue from business sources, from business revenue. And we need to do that. Businesses who use our resources here, use our customer base, who use our residents for employees, need to invest back in the community. And the way to do that is to invest in our kids' future. We're at a very difficult time here. Our education system is in serious trouble and in need of funding. We're 49th or 50th in the country. Is that the kind of legacy that we want to leave? Is that the kind of legacy that the business community represented by Karen wants to leave? I hope not.
Ms. Griffin, your rebuttal?
You know, Dan talks a lot about funding education, and unfortunately, I go back to the fact that the margin tax does not guarantee additional funds for education here in the state of Nevada. Those monies the money will go into the state's distributive school account, and certainly other money that is currently there could be taken out and used to fund other portions of the budget. The margin tax is deeply flawed. It is very costly. It doesn't guarantee additional funds for education, but it does guarantee higher consumer costs, trouble for small business. And that's time for that rebuttal.
And that is all the time we have for our questions. Now the closing statements. Dan Hart, you are first with yours.
Thank you. This, as you can see from this debate, my opponent and her corporate chieftains trying to make this as complicated as possible. It's really not. It's a very simple equation. Do you want to fund education, or do you want to protect corporate profits? That's what it's all about. And at the end of the day, that's the decision we all have to make. And I hope you'll join me in supporting question 3.
Thank you. And Ms. Griffin, your closing statement.
Dan likes to claim that question 3 is a tax to fund education. Again, it doesn't guarantee an additional dollar in education funding. The politicians can divert those funds just like they have in the past, and there is no plan for how any money would be spent and no accountability for how any of those funds would be spent. This is a deeply flawed tax, and it deserves a no vote on November 4th. For many, many reasons. You know, we could see the loss of thousands of jobs. We're talking at minimum about 9,000 jobs here in the state of Nevada could be lost if the margin tax passes in November. Consumers could see higher costs for things like food, rents, utilities, childcare, even your health care costs could rise as a result of the margin tax. Beyond that, because it doesn't exempt Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement payments, which are already well below the cost of care here in the state of Nevada, you could see fewer doctors accepting those patients. You could see access to care issues. You could see ER bed issues here in the state of Nevada. Those are some of the reasons that the margin tax deserves a no vote. Dan puts on a really strong case. He has a very simple and very easy message, but he doesn't tell the whole story. There's no plan, there's no guarantee, and there is no accountability for question 3. Please, I urge you to vote no on November.
Thank you, Ms. Griffin. Appreciate that. That's our debate. We'd like to thank Karen Griffin and Dan Hart for participating, and we'd like to thank you for watching. Please stick around because Republican Adam Laxalt and Democrat Ross Miller will face off in the Attorney General's debate that's just ahead.